This interview is part of the Oral History Project, sponsored by the State Bar of New Mexico and its Senior Lawyers Division. I am Terrence Revo, a member of the Senior Lawyers Division of the State Bar. Today is June 27th, 2007, and I am interviewing Mel Robbins in my office in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Mel, I want to thank you for coming today, and I want to ask you a little bit about what your life was like in your family and your community as you were growing up.
Fine, sure.
All right. So, what part of Albuquerque were you raised in?
I was raised in Ohio.
In Ohio?
Yeah, Columbus, Ohio.
When did you move to Albuquerque?
1951.
And who were your parents?
My father was Harry Robbins. My mother was Fanny Robbins. Later on, parents were divorced. She married a fellow named Goldstein after that.
Did your father tell you why he moved from Ohio to Albuquerque?
Yes, he had tuberculosis. And at the time he came here, which I think was 1942, the thinking in the East was that the tuberculars needed a high, dry climate, and this was suggested as being that. And he came here and got over the worst effects of the tuberculosis.
Was your dad a lawyer by the time he got to Albuquerque?
Oh, yes. Yeah, he became a lawyer in the mid-20s.
He was a local magistrate judge, was he not?
Mm-hmm, yes.
How long did he serve on the bench?
It was probably 6-7 years.
And how old were you during the period of time when he was on the bench?
Let's see. Probably in the 50s, early 60s.
When did you become a lawyer, Mel?
In 1944, in Dayton, Ohio.
Oh, so you were a lawyer also before you came out here?
Yeah.
Do you still maintain your Ohio membership?
It's forever, as I understand it.
And when did you start practicing here in Albuquerque?
1952.
What was your practice like?
Here?
Yeah, and back when you started.
In Ohio?
No, here in Albuquerque.
Here. Originally, I was in my father's office. He, at that time, was in private practice. And I think I was there about a year and a half. And then Eisenhower was elected president, and the U.S. attorney became a Republican, and probably with some help from my father, I went into the U.S. attorney's office as an assistant.
Who were some of the other assistants at that time?
Jim Borland. The U.S. attorney was Paul Arizolo. Jim Borland and who was it? The fellow later became a judge.
Maurice Sanchez?
No, he was the one that departed when he was replaced by Arizolo. From Silver City. I can't remember.
So how long were you in the U.S. Attorney's Office?
I was there 3 or 4 years.
How did you like that part of the practice?
Oh, I enjoyed it. I think it was the most enjoyable part of the practice at all the time that I practiced law, although there are other times too. But it was a real experience. We had a great judge. It was Carl Hatch, and it was a pleasure working with with him, and it was good work. I learned how to try cases there.
What kinds of cases did you handle as an assistant U.S. attorney?
Bank theft, bank robberies, Mann Act, that's transporting a woman across the lines for sexual purposes, auto theft, some immigration work that wasn't like it is now, but there was some of that.
So you were basically a criminal prosecutor as a U.S. attorney?
Yeah.
Going back to what I touched on before, what was life like in Albuquerque during the early 1950s?
It was very pleasant. As I think the population was around 90,000 people when we came here, and all the lawyers knew each other, and the town was, I think, very vibrant at the time.
Was it a growing community during those years?
Oh yes, yeah. The basis of it was, I think, Sandia Base, which was a steady employment thing. And the government was a big factor in the economy, too.
Was your dad a judge during that period of time?
No, no, he became a judge later. He was active in politics. He was the Republican state chairman and national committeeman, and so he did a lot of traveling around doing that kind of work. Also doing a little bit of law practice. And that was essentially what he did during that time.
So as a lawyer, I would assume that you didn't appear in front of your dad?
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, but you must have seen him in the courtroom.
I did.
Did you have any favorite stories about your dad that you'd like to share with us?
At times, I would compare notes with Mike Sutton, whose father was a judge, and we would count the number of times we hid under the table when our fathers were on the bench. They did unorthodox things, but they were each very much admired by many people, and they were also reviled by many people.
Well, in their unorthodoxy, did you see them as being fair administrators of justice?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, they were. I think my father introduced the idea that the police are not always right, that there are some times when they make mistakes too, and that some of their arrests were unauthorized and all of that. In fact, the police department during his tenure in office has got a petition to remove him from the bench, which did not succeed.
Any other stories regarding your dad that you'd like to share with us?
I didn't go in there very much. A lot of people tell me stories of their experiences with him. But when I was present, it wasn't too frequent or too enjoyable sometimes.
What was it about your either childhood or your adolescent experiences that made you decide to become a lawyer?
This, when I finished undergraduate school, this was during the war of Second World War. I was not in service, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I thought, well, I've enjoyed reading about politics. I've enjoyed reading about lawyers, etc. And my dad's been a lawyer, so why don't I do it?
Where did you go to law school?
Ohio State University.
All right. While you were in school, were there any professors or other role models who inspired you to continue on in the practice of law?
We had some, I thought, excellent professors. Mr. Hallen, Strong, they were good teachers. Of course, we had a very small law school because most of the people were drafted. I was forever. I had some problem with my ear. They kept telling me, "You come down each 6 months for an examination, and we'll take you the next time." But each time they'd look at my ear and say, "No, not this time."
So you had the opportunity to go to law school while World War II was going on.
That's right, yeah.
When you entered law school, did you have any idea what kind of lawyer you would become?
No.
So let me jump ahead to the time period after you left the U.S. Attorney's Office. What did you do then?
I joined Lorenzo Chavez and Art Ortega in their firm and practiced with them, and they did mostly personal injury work.
So you started as a personal injury lawyer in the late 50s, probably?
I think it was 56, yeah.
And how long did you work with those two gentlemen?
Art Ortega left us, I think, after about 4 or 5 years, and he started practicing on his own and with Bill Snead. I practiced with Lorenzo Chavez until 1973, I believe.
How was the personal injury practice different back then than it is today?
Well, I'm not sure what's happening today, but at that time it was, I think, more of the cases went to trial than today. I believe today there's a lot of mediation, and that didn't exist as far as I knew back at that time. And it didn't cost a huge amount of money to go to trial then, and now it's very expensive when you go to trial. And so I believe there was much more trials going on in these cases than now.
I've been told that back in those times that the trials were usually much shorter with fewer witnesses than they are today.
I believe that's true. And the files were this thick, and now you fill a room with all of the discovery and the pleadings and everything else.
So as a plaintiff's attorney during that period from the late 50s into the 70s, how often would you get to try a case?
I would say on an average of once a month.
And as you well, let me back up a little bit. What were the verdicts like back then compared to when you stopped practicing?
A verdict of $10,000 was considered respectable back in the late 50s, I think. Occasionally you'd hit on a bigger verdict, but they were not real large. It sort of changed over time, and it depended on the kind of cases. When malpractice became part of the practice of personal injury lawyers, I think the verdicts there were much larger.
Medical malpractice,
yeah,
you mean?
Yeah.
You had indicated that you practiced with Lorenzo Chavez until the early 70s.
Right.
And after that, what did you do?
I practiced for another year with Avelino Gutierrez, and then I started on my own. I associated with Leah Strand after I started on my own, but we had no formal relationship there.
So you and Leoff were basically
we were sharing space.
Sharing
right,
space.
Right.
How were trials different during the era of contributory negligence as opposed to comparative negligence?
Well, Mary Walters made a great contribution to the practice.
She certainly
when
did.
She came out with that opinion espousing comparative negligence. You didn't worry about, the negligence of your client so much with comparative negligence. But even in the days when contributory was supposed to be a bar to recovery, generally you could work with that and try to diminish the plaintiff's negligence, if any. And it just made it simpler to prepare and try.
How did the juries back in the days of contributory negligence, how did they work their way around the contributory negligence issue to come up with a favorable verdict?
I think they wanted to see a certain result. I think they could overcome the actions that might have constituted contributory negligence. It was an emotional thing, too.
Was it like the give and take in the jury room to reach what they thought was a fair decision?
I suppose you've sat outside jury rooms at times, as I did, and I gave it up after a while because the things that I thought were important in the trial, I would overhear from the other side of the door of the jury room, and they were considering something else completely. They reached what they felt was fair, I believe.
How did you feel about the jury verdicts back then? Did you feel they were fair? Did you feel they were biased one way or the other?
No, I thought they were fair. I think the juries were one of the best institutions that we've had in the practice of law. And for the most part, and there were times when I thought they went haywire, but most of the time I thought they did a reasonable job.
What kinds of memories do you have of the judges that you tried cases in front of?
I was trying to think. Judge Tackett was in there. He was he prompted settlements as much as he could. Judge McManus was present. He would take a case and sit on it for a while, and then on one day he would decide about 10 or 12 of them that he had been sitting on and make his decision. Reedy was quite decisive. Swope was indecisive, but he was a good judge, fair. McPherson was okay. I'm trying to think of some of the others there. Offhand, that's what I can think of.
Most of the cases that you actually tried, were they in state court or federal court also?
Most of them originally were in state court. Then later they began to they would be removed to federal court, and we tried them in federal court. And sometimes we filed in federal court, not often.
In those earlier days, was it typically the plaintiff or the defendant who asked for a jury?
Plaintiff.
Things are very different in today's world.
Is that so?
Well, the defense almost always asks for a jury trial in today's world.
Uh-huh.
So maybe the jury trials have become different.
Probably so, yeah. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Is there one or two people that you could point to who were particularly influential in your career?
Well, let's start. There's Paul Arizola, who was the U.S. attorney. He was very fair, unprejudiced man. And he was a good guide on how to be a prosecutor. He was very fair. Later on, I became friendly with Charlie Driscoll. And then Charlie, as you know, was a rather controversial person.
At times.
Yeah. And he gave me a lot of good ideas about what we should be as lawyers. That didn't mean that he or I would always follow those, but he had some good ideas, and he was a brilliant lawyer. On some occasions, he could do a wonderful job.
Did you ever go to his meetings down at Jack's Bar on Central?
That's right. Yeah. On what was the day? I forget. It was not Flag Day, but anyway, there was always
Law Day.
Law Day. That's right. Yeah.
He would have an on-law day party down on Central at Jack's.
Yeah.
Anybody else that you can think of that was influential in your career?
Well, Lorenzo and Art. Art taught me how to try a personal injury case. I had good trial experience when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, but when you get down to the field of personal injury, there are lots of new techniques that you use, and Art helped me a lot on that, and so did Lorenzo. And Lorenzo was he thought pretty well. He thought well, and he could come up with a lot of new ideas about what to do in these cases.
Speaking of cases, what cases that you handled over the years stand out in your mind?
One of them is a case, I believe the style is Miller versus State, in which I worked with Charlie Driscoll, and we brought the United States Constitution's Bill of Rights to the state of New Mexico courts, because until then, there was a silver plate doctrine where the federals would gather the case, and there was a lot of inadmissible evidence in the federal court, but they'd give it to the state prosecutors, and they would get convictions because there were no protections that we had instituted in this Miller case. And this was a important thing. From then on, the Bill of Rights under the federal Constitution were applied in New Mexico. I don't know how long ago that was.
So would it be fair to say that the federal rules of evidence were far stricter or more restrictive than any rules of evidence that the state of New Mexico had?
No, not in the matter of civil rights. They were much. Yeah, they were stricter than the New Mexico rule. That's right, and. And so the same standards were then applied in the state court.
Mm-hmm. Any other cases of yours that stand out in your mind that you think were either important or cases that you particularly enjoyed?
I had a case where a little child was mauled by a dog out in the canyon, and and the child had severe injuries from the mauling, and we eventually filed suit on it. And it had a lot of publicity at the time because it was a severe attack, and it was a dog that had been let to run loose from some lumber yard there, and the child lived nearby, and the dog attacked him. The child was taken into a hospital for surgery, and there was a nurse in surgery who was a dog lover, and she felt very protective about dogs, and she started a rumor that the child was not mauled by a dog but by his parents. And this spread through the entire community. I remember everybody knew that it was the parents who did it. And finally, we got a dentist who was a forensic witness. He had testified in some case in Florida where there was a well-known sex offender who was on trial, and he was one of the witnesses there. And he saw the pictures of this boy and called me and said, "You don't have to worry anymore." He said, "Those marks on the boy's face are identical to the configuration of the dog's teeth. And so it calmed down, and eventually it went on to settlement. But it was interesting while it was going on.
Did you try cases with other lawyers, or did you do most of your trial work yourself?
After I left Lorenzo, I tried most of them by myself, yeah, and sometimes with others.
Who were the other attorneys that you were associated with?
Leif Strandwood helped me on some of the cases. I don't remember any others in particular. Most of those, I believe, I tried alone. We had a big malpractice case in Gallup where Leif worked with me, and we got a good verdict to that one.
Did you ever try a case with your dad?
No.
How about with your daughter?
No.
Tell us about your daughter Jackie and why she decided to become an attorney.
She I don't think had any predetermination that she wanted to be a lawyer, but something came up involving her, and I remember as soon as it happened, there was a possibility that someone who she knew at the time might be prosecuted, and if that person was prosecuted, it might have involved her. And I went in to see Victor Ortega, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, and discuss this with him. And he had some suggestion as to how to handle it, and everything blew away. I think Jackie was quite impressed with the fact that there are ways of resolving some what could be serious problem. And I think that's when she sort of decided she'd like to be a lawyer. And she has been and enjoys it very much now.
And she's still doing criminal defense, I take it?
Yeah, that's all she does.
Wasn't she the public defender for the state for a while?
Yeah.
So she started out on the other side of the courtroom from where you started.
Criminal law, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What type of professional associations were you involved in during the time that you practiced law?
I was a member of the trial lawyers, New Mexico trial lawyers. I was on the board of the what's it known as now? The civil part of rendering aid to the people that need help.
Legal aid?
Legal aid, yeah. I was on the board of that. I was on the Supreme Court's disciplinary board. That was about it, I think. I belonged to the American Bar Association.
Were you one of the lawyers that helped create the trial lawyers?
No, there was a loose sort of an organization originally started by Joe Smith and Lorenzo Chavez, and I think Henry Kiker and Art Ortega. developed that type of activity. I think they got it started by the time I got to the practice with them. It was a fairly strong organization.
So you're talking about the trial lawyers organization being strong by the mid-50s?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Did you hold any offices in the trial lawyers organization?
No.
When you sat on the state disciplinary board, what were some of the more interesting issues, not naming names, but interesting issues that you had to address?
I don't think there was that many interesting issues, really. The usual things that come up in practice.
It sounded like when you were talking about the story with Victor Ortega that you went to see him, that in some respects the law and the administration of justice was more personal back then than it is today?
Oh, yeah, yeah. As I mentioned, I think people knew each other. Most of the people knew each other. And you could talk to each other without taking notes. So that's the way it was, I believe.
Would it be fair to say that the judges were more accessible to the attorneys and to the public back in those days?
I believe so. Now, I don't know how they are now, but they were, yeah, you could work with them.
When did you decide to retire?
I think it was 91, or maybe the end of 91.
And how come you decided to retire?
The honest answer is that I had participated in a trial shortly before this time. And when the instructions were being done, I failed to ask for an instruction that I was entitled to. And I don't know that contributed to the loss of the case, but it was a defense verdict, and I felt that I had missed something, and that I might be missing some other things from time to time. And it was a good time to get out of practice.
Well, I certainly can understand that.
And the reason I used, and it was true too, was both my mother, who had recently moved here, and my wife were ill at the time, and they needed attention too. So I thought this was a good time to stop working and doing something else.
So you became the caregiver for your mom and your wife?
Somewhat, yeah.
Now, your wife has since passed on?
Yeah.
In the 15 or 16 years since your retirement, what kinds of things have you been doing to occupy your time?
I don't have much time anymore. I can't, I'm not doing a thing, really. I read the papers in the morning. I listen to some operatic background while I'm reading. The mornings pass. At noon, I go to lunch with some former judges and lawyers. And we meet every day. And in the afternoons, I juggle around somehow and get through each day. Not any structured activity.
If it isn't too personal, may I ask who the people are that you still have contact with, the lawyers and the judges?
Yeah. Paul Mutusi, Phil Ashby, Dick Traub, sometimes the Kelleher brothers come down. Then I have a friend who calls himself a lawyer hang-on. He likes to be around lawyers and judges. He's not a lawyer, but he likes to listen, even though we don't discuss law much at all anymore.
Going back through your career in law that spanned it almost 50 years, what kinds of stories or anecdotes do you remember that you think are either funny or poignant?
I can't really come up with anything particularly right now. There are a lot of very interesting cases that I worked on. There nothing particular that I can assign to that. Yeah.
So the personal injury practice that you had, I take it was mostly automobiles, some malpractice, and then maybe falls and slip and falls and those type of things?
Toward the last 9 or 10 years that I practiced, I believe I concentrated more on medical malpractice. It was, which I thought was very interesting, and it was more lucrative. But I would handle other cases too, but it's odd. In 1972, I had a malpractice case referred to me from Detroit. And as of that time, malpractice was sort of looked down on by the bar. Claiming another professional did something that didn't meet the standard of care, and it really isn't right to go after another professional and all that business. Well, this was a case involving some doctors at the Air Force Base here, and so there wasn't that personal relationship that seemed to stop people in the past. And that case was eventually settled for a good sum of money. And I remember talking to some of the other fellows in the plaintiff's practice and saying, look, we've been trying these cases with automobiles bumping into each other and slip and fall type of things. This kind of work is more interesting, and it's more remunerative. And that I don't know that there wasn't any practice in that sort of thing before, but then the fellows that I talked to, they started accepting cases and went around looking for witnesses who would be able to testify to help the case, and that was a big problem then. I think it's changed somewhat now, but it was very difficult to get expert witnesses then.
Well, it still is somewhat difficult. You typically have to go outside of your community.
Go to California, yeah.
Did you have to do that in the later years?
I still had to do it. Yeah. But some of them were, very obvious cases of negligence, and didn't have to go to all those lengths.
You had indicated earlier in our discussion that there were a lot more trials and jury trials in the earlier days than there were in the later days. What do you think the reason for that is?
Part of the reason, I believe, is that the insurance companies thought they could win. And the plaintiff's counsel thought that they had a good case, and they went to trial. Now, I don't know when that changed. Well, there were so many cases filed that you got into this practice of mediation, where some of the lawyers would start doing mediating, usually retired judges, and got many of the cases settled that ordinarily might have gone through to trial. I think they did a good job of assessing the merits of the cases and making their views known to the lawyers on both sides.
You had talked about the dog bite case and that case that you tried with Charlie Driscoll. What do you think was your most either controversial or difficult case?
A civil rights case that I tried against Los Alamos nuclear labs. It was. I always thought, well, civil rights. It's easy. It's right there. They put up very strong defenses, and the law was, I thought, was very restrictive at the time. One of them came out well, one of them didn't. But I thought those were very difficult cases.
You've talked a lot about cases that you've tried and judges that you've known. Based upon your experience, what makes for a good jury trial?
I believe you need a client who is likable. And you need some facts to help the case along. Yeah.
How about the lawyers? What have you seen in terms of how lawyers make for good trials?
Well, generally the insurance company lawyers, they were in the large firms here. I think they were well prepared. They had good investigations and had a lot of practice. And when you had to go to trial, you had a lot of work to do to prevail on it. And on the plaintiff's side, it was same thing. If you're going to go, you have to be prepared and all that.
So it's the old adage of hard work and preparation is 98%.
Yeah. I remember whenever I went to trial, I would always look up a case that was on the decisive issue of the trial, and had it ready. And some judges, you got to that issue, they would appreciate being furnished with the case that was controlling. So.
And other judges?
Well, they had their approach to it.
In the years that you've been trying cases, what perceptions have you developed regarding our jury system and the concept of trial by a jury of your peers?
I think it's it's a great institution. It makes people more human, I believe, and including the lawyers, to work with the jury on these cases. And one of its purposes, I think, is that the fact that there will be a jury in a case causes each side to settle more often than if it's going to be tried to a judge alone. Because juries are somewhat unpredictable, and as strong as you believe your case is, it doesn't mean that the jury would see it that way.
Lawyers have a habit of saying, I think a Bernalillo County jury is going to do this, or I think a Bernalillo County jury is going to do that with this case. Have you seen that there are very many lawyers who have the ability to predict what a jury is going to do?
I don't think so. They have a feeling about it, I know. There's certain counties I enjoyed trying cases in: McKinley County, Valencia County, at one time Santa Fe County. But, yeah, there were facts to be dealt with.
Do you think that the juries, not the jury system, but the juries themselves, have changed over the years that you've been trying cases?
The composition of the juries?
The composition, or the way the jurors look at the lawyers, the parties, the facts.
I think when I first started doing civil trial work, the juries were probably more sympathetic to the plaintiffs. And the defense bar and the insurance companies came along and started infiltrating the news and and insurance companies would circulate articles, other things about, excessive verdicts, and they would play up the odd cases where there was a verdict. And I think that has made the juries as a whole more conservative in their approach to cases.
How has the practice or the legal community changed during the course of your career? During
the time that I was practicing. What was your question again?
Oh, sure. How has the practice of law or the legal community changed during the course of your career?
During that time, at the beginning of it, and most of the way through until I stopped working, we were familiar with each other, and generally, if we took each other's words at their face value, and you say you're going to do this, and the other side would say, okay, that's all right, or you reach some understanding on something. And rarely, as far as I can tell, was there anyone, writing it down as these words were said. And you took each other's word on matters. I think that was changing toward the end. You're getting many more lawyers, and you're getting many people who you don't know, and there's a matter of put it in writing, which is a change from the way it was.
You talked about a number of the famous plaintiffs' attorneys that we've all heard their names over the years. You haven't mentioned any of the defense lawyers who defended the cases that you tried. Who in that category is of memory to you?
Jim Volantis from Judge Johnson's office. The Rhodey lawyers, I'm trying to think now. There's Jim Toulouse, Ray Rhodey, Chuck. I forget his name now. Jim Ritchie, Joe Rail.
Did you ever try a case against Richard Civerola?
Oh yeah, many times.
What was he like to try a case against?
He was very very severe in his trial techniques and practices. I was trying a case against him in Gallup once, and he had put his witness on the stand, and I was walking toward the podium to do cross-examination. And I heard him whispering to Wayne Wolf, he's going to ask for his statement. He was referring to his witness's statement. And frankly, that hadn't occurred to me, but I got up to the podium and asked the witness, have you given a statement in this case? And Dick screamed and jumped out of his chair and said, I object. But he was very aggressive in his trial techniques, and outside of court, he was easy to get along with.
Did you find that with most of the lawyers that you tried cases against, that they were one way in the courtroom, another way outside the courtroom?
Yeah, there was. So yeah, I believe so. They did their work in the courtroom, and sometimes you could get along with them afterward.
Okay, we're going to go off the record for just a moment here.
Yeah.
We're now back on the record. We needed to go off the record to change the tape. Mel, the next thing I want to ask you about is, what do you think your most significant contribution to the practice of law or to your clients was during your career?
I think the idea of doing a good job and a thorough job. I'm not sure I was always real thorough, but I was trying to be thorough. And trying to show integrity in the practice is important, and I think I generally conveyed that impression.
Now, you're saying that in terms of, in regard to your clients, as well as the other attorneys and judges that you dealt with?
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the legal advertising that you see in today's world?
Well, I've adopted the feeling of the U.S. Supreme Court that to make the services available to the public is important, and advertising is one way of doing it. And I'm sure that many people would not have obtained legal services unless there was this advertising to make some lawyers available to them. And from that standpoint, I think it was necessary. I don't particularly like, because I started practicing at a time when advertising was supposedly not permitted, and some of the things that I see or hear today I think are excessive and self-promoting too much. But generally, I guess it's okay, so the people will know that there are ways of getting to court and getting what they're entitled to.
You said back when you became a lawyer, advertising was not considered to be a good thing, or that it was unprofessional for a lawyer to do that. When you left the U.S. Attorney's Office, for example, how did you develop a practice?
Well, I went into an established practice with Lorenzo Chavez and Art Ortega. They had a good practice.
And then in the 70s, when you went out on your own,
Mm-hmm.
How did you maintain a good, healthy client base?
At times I wondered if I would have a client, but mostly by referrals from other lawyers, I believe. That was probably where most of the work came from, and then some people would come back if they had, or a relative of someone that I had represented would come in.
Do you have any words of wisdom to the younger lawyers starting to practice in today's legal world?
Yeah, be prepared and work hard and be prepared and be on top of the case. Because from what I hear, there are a lot of people who are just walking into something and not having prepared themselves, and they take a beating on these things.
Anything else that you'd like to share with us before we conclude today?
No, I think you've covered a lot of ground.
All right. Well, I thank you very much for taking your time to come in and talk with me today. And we're going to conclude the interview, and we'll keep this interview in a database or in a library, and it'll be accessible to you or your family anytime you'd like.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to turn off the tape now.